In the heart of the state-of-the-art, at the dawn of the next stage in entertainment, you found No Proscenium.
You have indeed found No Proscenium, the voice of everything immersive. I'm your host, Noah Nelson, and welcome to episode 427 of our ongoing exploration of the immersive cosmos. Joining us this week is designer Jaden Andrea, most recently the art director of Gather, and now back to being freelance, who is one of my favorite people to talk about art, immersive and otherwise, with. Think of this as an episode of eavesdropping on a conversation between friends as we talk Neotropolis, Gather, installation art, and wax philosophical for a bit. It's a very old school episode of No Pro this week. Before we get into it, a few reminders and an announcement. Last week, we told you about the pre-sale for Corinne Wick's casting in New York City at Gymnopedie, which was live for our Patreon backers last weekend. This show is now on sale for all, and the ticket is so hot, they're adding shows. Now, before casting hits, Patchwork Adventures has arranged a whole slate of experiences on the weekend of March 2nd in New York City, and packages are still available. This $400 package includes Patchwork's own Order of the Golden Scribe initiation tea, Shadow Traffic's competitive winter picnicking awards ceremony, mixer and surprises at the Lowercase, the Great Gotham Challenge's terminal time trial, Roaring Twenties Death by Bathtub Gin by Broadway Murder Mysteries, and The Tiger's Bride by Theater Uzume. For another $60, buyers can also get Linked Dance Theater's 10th anniversary intimate show for one winner's walk to add to the weekend. Links for both are in the show notes. Now, I got something to tell you about in LA. As some of you already know, the LA Immersive Invitational, which is produced by our good friends and partners at After Hours Theater Company, and yeah, we're part of this process too. It is the very event where casting was incubated back in 2019. It's returning this April. After WOW, not immediately after, but a bit after WOW, which is in San Diego this year, the big Without Walls Festival. Next week, No Pro backers are going to be able to get in on the pre-sale for the Sunday showcase of the LA Immersive Invitational. If you don't remember how the Invitational works, it's a 48-hour film festival style format where we have, this time we're inviting 8 teams to the location. They've got 48 hours to put together a show, and we run it on Sunday. And then they take the shows and they do whatever they want with them. Maybe they put them in a closet and never bring them back out. Maybe they take them all around the country. Both have happened. The tickets, though, for the Sunday showcase, which is where the public gets to come in, it is exceptionally limited. Around 100 in total for the 2 primary runs, and less than 30 for the pre-sales, for the previews, because we reserve some for, folks to, bring people in. We're going to be rolling more out about the Invitational, including who's being invited over the coming weeks. The short version, and we've got that figured out. So that's not like, no, we've got a plan to roll it out here. The short version is, if you're an immersive fan in LA, you don't want to miss the chance to catch lightning in a bottle. It's a really, really special event. Not just for the folks making everything, where it's awesome, but also just so much fun. People have so much fun checking out this work. Backers, keep an eye on the Patreon, because you're going to get that chance before everybody else. Speaking of, this week we'd like to thank Stephen Hammond and Lydia for becoming new backers, Jason Moore for bumping his pledge, and Elena Doe for going annual. This March we'll be on the march to get our paid membership numbers up, and as part of that we'll be inviting our paid backers to the live Emmys Award presentation, surprise announcement, that will take place on March 14th. Yes, we're bringing the Emmys back. We're going after the Oscars because life's been a mess lately. And more on that in the Patreon next week as well, including how voting for the Emmys is going to work this year. And maybe I'll talk a little bit about that after. It's a long episode. I'm not going to talk about that at the end. We'll talk next week about that. But how voting is going to work to be part of all of it, the pre-sale for the Invitational, to get in on the Emmys action, all of this. Head on over to patreon.com/noproscenium for the hookup. As always, big thanks to our sustaining backers, Samuel Mystery, Chris Woolman, Samantha Davison, Eric Shamlin, Elaine, Daryl, John Boulette, Cameo Wood, Jay Bushman, Jerome Joseph Gentes, Kurt Collins, Ryan, David Bassick, Richard Ayers, Lonnie Hands-On, Lecker LeCool, The Ministry of Peculiarities, and Jan Budman. And hey, if you want to get this audience paying attention to you, hit me up at noah@noproscenium.com. We have ways. Joining us on the show this week is designer Jaden Andrea, most recently the art director of Gather, the virtual gathering spot for remote teams that was home to more than a few interactive experiences during the height of the pandemic, and who has done installation work at Lightning in a Bottle, Neotropolis, and Burning Man. I should also say, for disclosure purposes, that Jaden has at various points in time been a sustaining backer of the show, but more importantly is someone I count as a friend. Jaden, thanks for being on the show.
My pleasure, Noah. Thanks for having me on.
This will ultimately probably turn into something kind of like one of the phone conversations we have when one or the other of us is driving a long distance, because that's a thing that we do. But I wanted, and I know our intent, at least my original intent here, was that we be waxing philosophical about art. But I actually want to start with something you did last year for Funsies, something that our own Anthony Robinson got to be part of. And that's this whole memory thing you did at Neotropolis last year. But I suppose before we do that, we have to explain what Neotropolis is. So what is Neotropolis and what were you doing out there?
Sure, absolutely. Neotropolis is run by the same folks that started and continue to run Wasteland Weekend, which is a sort of old style Burning Man festival. It's a little more gritty than Burning Man has become. Burning Man used to be, hardly any rules. You might die, pretty gritty, and it's been a bit less so that as the population that attends Burning Man has grown and grown over the last decades. And Wasteland Weekend has kind of been this whole like stake out there where people who want that kind of like gritty feeling go and kind of live a more Mad Max like diesel punk fantasy. And 2 years ago, the organizing group decided to make a similar festival in a cyberpunk dystopic world. So Neotropolis is still a pretty fresh young festival. We're like figuring out what the lore is still. It's a 5-day, fully immersive science fiction in the desert festival where there's a theme zone where you must be in costume. It's got to be like a real fully immersive world. And if you're an attendee, you're a participant.
So you were an attendee, which, as you just said, made you a participant. What was it that you brought out there? What was the thing that you were doing?
Right. So you mentioned this memory thing. That's actually Anthony's personal contribution to our faction. So I didn't have anything to do with this like memory project. Let me explain that as a faction, you can become part of the cyberpunk city block if you are bringing kind of a consistent, or not a consistent, if you can be a faction in the city block of Neotropolis if you have kind of something that you're bringing, something significant, a piece of art, a performance, a game, a really strong vibe, something to that effect. And so last year was the 13s, Anthony and my faction. We are a Friday the 13th cult and VHS speakeasy lounge. Our whole thing is that these VHSs are relics of the past, and we treat them like they're prophetic. And we also try to capture people's essences by downloading their memory and creating save points for where they are right at that moment in the world, so that, should something happen to them, uh, will make sure that their consciousness gets rebooted into some kind of synthetic body, but only if you're a member of our cult. So if you want to make sure that you can always back up to your previous save point, then join the 13s. That's kind of the vibe there.
Y'all brought the quick save option to the festival, so
Oh yes.
yeah. So yeah, no. From what I know, like Anthony did like a whole audio based thing, and then like he basically it was a one-on-one encounter that was done inside the space that you had built. So like,
Right.
how long were you working on that space? Tell us about that one.
So I did something different with my cyberpunk speakeasy environment, and that was that I lived inside of a room in Portland, Oregon, which started off as a blank slate, and I built the installation around me, knowing that I was going to break it down and bring it to Neotropolis. So I had a bed set up in it, and I lived in it, and I was working for Gather at the time still, and so I did my remote work there. And then anytime I wasn't working, I was creating this installation all around me and like living in it. And I was really trying to get into the headspace of this like cyberpunk dystopia being our reality.
So what physical kinds of objects were in that room you were building? So you've mentioned like the VHS tapes were a part of it. So like,
Mhm.
what are the elements that are going into the aesthetic here? What was the build?
Yeah. Okay. Speaking as someone who got started with more like historic environments, like vintage, like I'm trying to make a 1890s, 1930s Art Deco, or like, like World War II era, or like whatever. Making something that's supposed to be from the future was really fun because the objects that made up the installation were either things from the past or present that had a futuristic vibe. So I was the filter for deciding what I think a futuristic vibe is, or things that I personally fabricated. And those two things together make an idea of what I think the future might be like. So there was some clean mid-century stuff. I think that like something that looks like it used to be metallic and shiny and chrome with some rust and deterioration and denting and scarred up, like being scarred up and dirty. Um, I was looking for stuff like that, all kinds of antique malls or on the side of the road, um, or I was dirtying things up myself. And I also set up a 3D printer, and I was printing stuff, and it was a Delta 3D printer, which like moves in a different kind of way than most 3D printers. It has this like head that moves on three belts, and it kind of like it moves itself around using the belts as opposed to being on like linear rails. So it
Hmm.
has a kind of weird, like awesome robotic, different style of like 3D printing to it. So I like the look of that, but it was also very functional. Like I lived in the room. The couch was this like bright orange woven like kidney bean shaped couch with a back that looked kind of futuristic, like something that would have stood out even, when it was probably made in the 80s, but it kind of had this like 60s sort of like mod vibe to it.
Oh, that's
But I
interesting.
could
It's
see
kind of like
it.
something that was like something that is old, but
Hmm.
like was trying to reach back to a previous era. So like these eras like talking to each other, something manufactured in one era, reaching back, but all at the same time looking forward because the mod stuff was also trying to be futuristic.
Exactly. Oh,
Oh,
retrofuturism. I didn't want it to
yeah.
be a retrofuturist space, but I have a real soft spot for retrofuturism anyway, so I let myself like just select some stuff that was retrofuture, and I really liked the fact that I had to construct an image of the future using like basically things from the past or things that I created myself. Very funny.
So this was not the first time you did like an installation piece at a festival. I guess, what have you learned over the years about making installations for things like Neotropolis and Burning Man and Lightning in a Bottle?
Wow. Well, I think that when it comes to working at festivals, you really have to let go of a huge amount of, personal ownership or ego over something. So I, I would say that coming together in a group with a lot of ideas and having those ideas be like malleable and like change based on what other people want it to be and making it really collaborative. That's what it needs to be when you're working in a large group, like for festivals or just in companies that have many people working on a set or whatever. So I would say that's the biggest lesson overall that I learned is like, even if I have a really strong idea, I like make concept art, I like have a some fantasy of what the perfect version of the thing would look like if I had all the money and time and in the world. The fact is that you can come with all those fun ideas, but everything's going to change, and it's going to be, you're going to contribute your part of it, and other people are going to contribute their part of it too, to make something even better than what you could do alone.
What's been some of the work in that mode, in the festival mode, that you're happiest with how it turned out?
Well, 2 summers ago, I worked with this guy named Wes, who has been part of the Lightning in a Bottle and like some other festival uh, installation work for a long time. And I think that my favorite recent project in that kind of vein, it was with him, because he embodied that whole idea of just having really strong ideas about what the story we're telling is, but then once people are there on the ground making their thing, it just he was just so enthusiastic, and he really let people take their inspiration and run with it and contribute to his overall vision of what it was supposed to be. And that summer it was Bark Kitten, which was our jab, I guess, at Meow Wolf. Love Meow Wolf, love you guys. So we were Bark Kitten at Lightning in a Bottle, and we were trying to make a main street. And so we actually had a number of sets that were trying to evoke different time periods and types of stores. We also had a VHS store. We had a travel agency and a broken down like furniture repair store and a theater with a huge marquee.
This is a lot
Um,
of stuff. How big? You said Main Street, like
it was
almost a
a
city
main
block,
street. Well,
like a city
no,
a city
just a
block or more.
strip, not a whole block, but like a main street facades. And and I'm impressed by how cheaply it was able to be done. But that's partly because Wes and a couple other folks who are on the team uh, work in Southern California, where there's like you know a lot of facades are made for film and television that end up just being thrown out or repurposed. And so you can get, I can't remember the name of they we acquired, or he acquired, a lot of these like facade pieces, and so for really cheap we would just repurpose them because he had a place to store them ahead of Lightning in a Bottle. So we repainted them and changed them, and added ceilings and recut certain elements of these facades, but a lot of them were pre-built for film and television productions.
So we've talked a bit about some of the physical installation stuff you've worked on and been a part of. Uh, you got a job at Gather during the heart of the pandemic, and wound up as art director by the time your tenure there was done. Um, what applied from making physical installations to making, and I'll take a stab here at describing Gather real quick, because Gather was kind of this like 16-bit era video game interface for like video conferencing and team co-working. And there were quite a number of people who did interactive kind of immersive theater-y type stuff and murder mystery stuff inside that interface. And you got started as building like kind of like one-off environments for it, and then got like absorbed into the company itself, and ultimately art director. But this modality though is like going from doing IRL installations, and like when we first met, like that was your focus, was like doing in-person installation work and art, and then you translated it all into these like flat digital spaces. Like how much does it translate? Like making virtual spaces, particularly like non 3D virtual spaces. How much is there a relationship between the two crafts?
Well, the way that I looked at it was that I had I had the ability to create on a two-dimensional plane any any environment that I wanted without having to spend any money on props and fabrication and materials. I could just use pixels, and I have a traditional arts background, so the drawing aspect of it, like making all of the backgrounds and the pixel art, it was pretty easy to apply myself to. But coming from the point of view of an environment designer, it was really fun because it felt freeing. It was like, oh, I want to make like a environment that looks like it's inside of a big birthday cake. I could just draw it, and people would be experiencing it, like walking around it, because that's the way that Gather worked. It was a proximity chat, or it is a proximity chat platform. So you can explore the virtual spaces that you're in, using the arrow keys and moving your little character around. So I could really do set design and prop making through pixel art. And at first, before I got involved as a full-time employee at Gather, I was working with smaller, theater productions that were going virtual during the pandemic. Like there was Dragon Theater. I think they're in Bay Area. They were Bay Area based, and they had some really fun ideas where we were able to do things that like you can't do in real life, like shrink people down to like 4 inches tall and have them walk around the inside of a refrigerator, interacting with like giant food and stuff like that. Like that's like something that could take hundreds of thousands of dollars to make in real life. Is try to make someone feel really small, but virtually you can just do it, which is just amazing. I guess what I'm trying to say is it there was nothing that we could do about in-person immersive theater and entertainment being unsafe at that time. So moving virtual was the only thing that could really be done. And a lot of theater companies moved there. And I actually found out about Gather because of meeting Terrence LeClaire at the Spring Fling on Discord. And it was his birthday. And he was like, I'm having a birthday party in Gather. And basically from that day forward, I started making environments and sharing about them on Twitter. And one of the spaces that I made a couple. I made one for myself called Nostalgia Purgatory, which obviously, and then that was like a black and white, like uh, kind of weird, spooky little room. And then I made a kind of painterly campsite that was inspired by Gravity Falls because I was watching Gravity Falls that summer. And then I made another one that was a cafe, like a co-working cafe, because I wanted people to come and hang out. And there was a couple of websites that kind of had a resurgence in popularity during COVID, which were like I Miss My Cafe or like Rainy Mood or something like that, where people could kind of like craft like an audio environment around like spaces that they used to do work, or like a third place, kind of soundscape. And one of them was full of cafe sounds, and I'm the kind of person who likes to work in cafes sometimes too. So I wanted to make a little virtual Gather cafe. I posted about it on Twitter, and Philip, the CEO of Gather, found it, and so did a Wired writer named Gretchen. She had just written a piece that was concerning Gather, and both of them showed up. And I remember that I kept the space open on my laptop just because I wanted to be virtually present somewhere. And I was laying in my bed watching the Venture Brothers, trying to waste away the hours. And I suddenly heard voices coming from my laptop, and I ran over to my virtual cafe. And sure enough, there was Philip, the CEO of Gather, like behind the bar, dropping images of latte art and stuff, and like role playing barista. And Gretchen was there, and a couple other really, really early Gather employees were there. So I met him, and I was like, man, I would love to work for Gather. This is just such an awesome platform. And I emailed the then art director, Mark Carpenter. And honestly, he didn't even take a look at my resume. I just showed him the spaces that I made, and I was like, this is what I do, this is what I'm into. And he gave me a couple of art tests, and I was like, here's an example of the kind of pixel art that I can do. And I just got into it, and I was hired as their first official pixel artist.
Literally a case of if you build it, they will come, right? Like you, like you just like the people who gave you a job just like wandered into the virtual cafe that you built while you were watching a cartoon. That's some pretty charmed action right there for that chapter to start off with. You mentioned one of the spaces you built was Nostalgia Purgatory, and that is one of your handles on Instagram, and is a kind of a long running project of yours. And indeed, there's like a hidden episode of No Pro, actually, a missing episode of No Pro, from a physical version of it that you were doing at one point that didn't unfortunately didn't get to open. But tell us about the Nostalgia Purgatory like cycle, because this is the long running kind of background arc of your career so far.
That's true. I got I really like coming up with titles to things. Like I think that Nostalgia Purgatory is one that I've really latched onto as a title for like not just one but a few pieces of mine, because it really captures the subject matter that I am drawn to. I got started in immersive, before I kind of knew the word for it, by getting into like historic reenactment when I was a teenager. I used to go swing dancing at downtown Disney every Friday night, and I was like probably 15, 16 years old. There were a bunch of other people in their like late teens, early 20s that were dressed like to the nines, like an accurate, like period authentic vintage. And I was like, well, I want to hang out with these guys. So I got really into that kind of thing. And I've always really been interested in telling stories that are set in the past as like a a way to teach people about things that happened in history, but not just like a history lesson, like really like specific on the individual level. Like there was a real person named this who had this kind of life and had this drama like unfold in their life. So really like really lesser known stories from the past that say something about what like living in the past felt like. So nostalgia purgatory really like is a coupling of words that feels good to me because it evokes this idea of being trapped in nostalgia, like forever. And I try to be very wary of not painting the past with like rose tinted glasses, but I do collect a lot of antiques, and I used to do a lot of like prop building and collecting and set dressing and stuff for like smaller immersive theater productions. And so I've amassed a collection of antiques. And it feels like sometimes I'm in nostalgia purgatory all the time. Um, but the first time I ever used that as a title to a piece was when I was in college. It was my senior year, in 2018. I was a sculpture student at RISD, and I knew that I wanted to get into themed entertainment. And I really was inspired by Sleep No More. I remember I used to tell people about the concept of Sleep No More for years before I ever had the opportunity to see it in person. I was like, imagine you're stumbling upon scenes, you eavesdrop on conversations. Like I was like telling people, I was giving people the spiel, and I'd never even been before because I was so like, yes, like that's the kind of entertainment I want to. I want to like live out a video game RPG in real life, you know. So I was really happy that they were doing something that kind of felt like that. So that was the kind of basis for my senior thesis project, which I built out into a loading dock of an art gallery. So for my senior show, with all my other classmates, I had this like section in the back where I built a bunch of theater flats and did the lighting and the sound, and I hand painted wallpaper patterns in charcoal. Used a brad nailer to put wainscoting on these theater flats, and just like built this like little L-shaped thing. There was a couple of chapters of this like walkthrough experience called Nostalgia Purgatory, and it started with your funeral. So I set up chairs, and the front of the experience before you entered it was supposed to evoke like an empty funeral parlor. So the first thing that you see when you're in the your funeral section of Nostalgia Purgatory is a standing coffin. The audience would open the coffin door and close it on themselves and descend down this hallway. So they're crossing the threshold of death, like intentionally. That's how I talked about it. Then in the hallway, I wanted to create this kind of descent into the underground. So I used wood reed, which is like flexible, especially when wet, this like coil of wood fiber. And I drilled into the hallway and like wove the wood, so it kind of felt like a root system. And it kind of transitioned from wood weaving web into hallway made of theater flats with like wainscoting and wallpaper and peepholes on doors. And if you look through the peepholes on the doors, then you would see a little diorama behind the peepholes that represented these like archetypes of storytelling. I really love the archetypes that you find in like tarot cards, for instance, because they can be related to any aspect of any not just anybody's life, which is why people use them as a tool in that way, but also like traditional storytelling. Like if you lay down random cards from a tarot card deck, you can ask yourself like, what does if this is a beginning, middle, and end of a story, like, do I know a fairy tale that like has, and I've done this with a friend of mine before, and you can always come up with something like Itsy Bitsy Spider or like Snow White or whatever. Like if you like take a look at like 3 random archetypes, your brain will fill in the gaps and you can just like apply storytelling to it. Or like tales, like human, like fables, and anything anything that has to do with human archetypes, which is like all stories, so you can relate them. So I was trying to grab onto tarot card archetypes for these peephole dioramas so that I could just kind of talk about storytelling in a kind of nostalgic, like vague way, like a room that represents the like nightmares, or like feeling like safe and at home, or like childhood or something like that. And at the end of the hallway was the room that I actually called Nostalgia Purgatory, which was full of all of these antiquated, machines and glassware, like uranium glass, stuff like that, blacklit. And I have a collection of phonographs, so I had a couple of phonographs on display, and I was playing St. James Infirmary Blues by Cab Calloway. It was very dark, and there was only like a red light and the green glow of the uranium glass. And if you turn the corner at the end of the hallway and you're in that room solidly, you see a vanity that reflects yourself. And my friend Jen Valentino, who played this ethereal medium in Nostalgia Purgatory, and she would read the tarot card, read the cards to every person that went through the space. They would sit down in a chair across from her and she would talk to them about their life. And she's a very gifted reader. So everybody got a personalized reading that was like pretty short, so I could get people to come through. But I asked her to keep the death card up her sleeve so that she could talk about how would that person feel if this was the end, if they crossed over the threshold of death and they had to grapple with their unfinished business, and what would they be disappointed by not being able to finish? What would their loose ends be, and what would they do if they were given a second chance to go and try and finish those things that they want to do in life? So there was that kind of conversation that would happen with everybody that came through. They would have a very like solo journey exploring the space, looking at all the weird antiques and the weird dioramas and everything that I did. And then at the end, they would be presented with this like one-on-one conversation about their life and about what they would do if they were given another chance at life. If this was the end, what next? And then they would leave through a blue velvet curtain and go back to the art gallery with a second chance at living, I guess. So that's kind of what that first nostalgia purgatory was, and I really want to hold on to that one and maybe do it again one day. So I just decided to hang on to the title, and I use that title a lot. I mean, I use it as my social media handle. I use it as my website URL, and I'm certain that I'll make that piece again one day in a way that more people can experience rather than just the people who happen to go to my senior show.
It's I've gotten to see images of it because it's on your portfolio, etc. And it is a really striking looking piece, right? Like particularly that the coffin as a threshold and just that kind of detail, right? Like completely sets the frame for what you're going to encounter, right? And we talk a lot about the magic circle or crossing the threshold in immersive and sort of priming people for things, and that kind of attention to detail in the actual what is the portal itself, right? um which it's funny because like we're recording this the week that Universal announced Epic Universe, which is their third gate in Orlando. Hey, look, everybody, I used theme park terminology. So the third gate in Orlando, and the thing they're making a big deal design wise out is like each of the lands is going to have this portal, right? Like the clock, you go underneath this clock tower, which is a portal, and you get on like their version of Main Street, which is called Celestial Park. And then each of the various lands, whether it's How to Train Your Dragon or Universal Monsters or that book series they keep on doing stuff about, each one's got this like uh this semicircle portal. If you've been reading the X-Men comics, it looks kind of like a Krakoan portal, but more mechanical than biomechanical. And that idea of a simple framing device of like, oh, you're leaping off into another dimension, right? Like gets people in a particular mode of play, right? And how you invite someone in, how you bring them across, it's almost, I don't know if this works this way for you. So this is my question. Like I kind of feel like a good portal feels like a question, right? Like it feels like an offer to think about a particular mystery, a particular mode of being, and mystery in the big sense, right? Like not like who killed Arnold Palmer. Arnold Palmer's not
Arnold
dead, I don't
Palmer.
think. Is he? Wait, I don't know.
Yeah.
Just I thought of a name and it came out Arnold Palmer. I don't know why. But this idea of maybe I'm thirsty, everybody. Um, like a coffin is going to set you up to think about everything you're just talking about what would you do, or what if this was the end, right? Like that physical manifestation of the question in the form of walking through the coffin.
Yeah, I think that the threshold is such a fun concept to explore in architecture, in interior architecture, in theme park design, and video game design, because even in software design. You and I were talking about how I relate this like feeling of forgetfulness when you walk into a room. It's we started talking about the phenomenology of perception, which Merleau-Ponty like wrote 100 years ago. It's like this idea of how when you walk into a new room, your brain just resets and you're thinking about all of the things that were important to you in that space the last time that you were in it.
Mm.
And how I experienced the same thing on my cell phone. I like open up a web page and I completely forget what I was opening it up for. And the same thing happens in physical architecture too. So I think that even the idea of the threshold can be applied to software design. And I thought about that a lot with Gather too.
How so? How do you think about that in terms of Gather?
Well, we have virtual permanent architecture, visually described with like pixel art spaces. So if you have a virtual office that you log into Monday through Friday, it's just like walking into the real office, which is part of the reason that people who are really enthusiastic about, doing their remote work with their company and gather, it's like it feels like you're really going into the office. You have this visual depiction of architecture that make you feel like you're there. You have a desk to sit at, and when you're sitting at your desk, you're thinking about work. And when you walk your character over to the all hands room, then you're thinking about like the things that were discussed at all hands previous. And so this like kind of feeling of spatial memory that we develop when we're going through the spaces that we inhabit in life, it applies to our computers and our phones as well. Like when we open up our saved tabs and we're like, oh well, I always keep my email on the far left or whatever. It's like it becomes this like layout in our mind, like the floor
Yeah.
plan of our home.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this one a bit because I've been thinking about like Apple's, whole framework of this is, the spatial computing age, right? And so we're also talking the week that like the Vision Pro reviews started coming out, and I mean, look, that thing is like way too expensive for like a normal person, right? It's like given what it does right now, it's like it costs the same amount as a high end MacBook Pro. And if like you need a lot of compute, just go get a high end MacBook Pro at this moment. But this idea of you can leave windows in a room and then come back to it. I get very excited about the idea that I could drop my recipe apps in the kitchen and then walk over to the kitchen and my recipe apps are waiting for me, like sitting like tagged onto like a surface, and I can just like scroll through. I mean, this is not how it's actually working right now. You have to do some other stuff and like it, but to some degree you can leave windows in places, which is great, right? It'll remember, which is really cool. And that's kind of a fundamental ground of creating this sort of like virtual spatialized information tier happening.
Oh yeah. You know
But
what, Noah? There's this video game that is the perfect like visualization of what I think the like ideal augmented reality would like look like. And it's this video game called Heavy Rain, which came out around this like at the same time that the PlayStation Move and like the Wii and like all that kind of like
oh yeah,
you move.
one of the Quantic Dream, an early Quantic Dream game, if memory
Yeah,
serves. Yeah,
I'm not sure, but I do
I'll look that
remember
up.
that as the main character, you when you look into your virtual files, you like it's this like awesome like office that he conjures around him. It's like and you can change the theme of your office too. Like maybe you want to be looking through your file cabinet at the top of a waterfall or whatever. So you can change your virtual environment. And then the way that he pulls files from his investigation out is he makes a gesture with his hand, which is like, there's gestural kind of stuff is really a huge way that we interact with our devices nowadays. And he opens a file cabinet and he uses his fingers to really like file through and find what he's looking for, and he pulls it up and he opens it and then he spreads them around him like a curved monitor, and he just spreads all the files that he wants to look at all around him. And it's this awesome mix of like, how would you have done that the old way by looking through a file cabinet, and how would you do that in like the fantasy futuristic way, which is like, well, I throw them up into the air and they stay exactly where it will be easy for me to read them and I don't have to touch them anymore.
Yeah, well, that's related to like the idea of the art of memory and like mind palaces and memory palaces, right?
Mhm.
Which actually stretches back to Rome, right? Like there's a incredibly influential book by Frances Yates, who was a mid-century uh, art historian scholar. Her main concern was Giordano Bruno, who was the scientist during the Renaissance, one of the kind of folks who got persecuted, right, for doing science. And one little thread in Bruno's oeuvre is his own system for memory, and his known mnemonic system, and that got Yates deeply interested in this kind of hidden art form, which had been lost, the Ars Memoria. And uh, so Yates's book, The Art of Memory, hugely influential to like a lot of people. It took me it took me like 13 years to get through it because it is dense and I was bouncing off of it over and over again. And sometimes I think about going back and rereading it because I think I could probably tackle it a little bit quicker now. But I also started reading it when I was like 19 or something like that. I found out about it. I was like, what? And if you've ever watched, say, Sherlock, right, like the Benedict Cumberbatch Sherlock Holmes show, when he's like standing there and like, you know, doing hand gestures and shuffling ideas around, right? Like that's the idea that he's in his memory palace. Or you see it in Alan Wake 2, which just came out, that there's a mind place that the main character goes to, or one of the main character goes. Actually, both main characters go to a mind place of sorts, and arrange things on boards, you know, in their head, as it were. And that's sort of this thing that people are chasing right now because there's some truth, you know, to the idea that we tag ideas to spaces. We tag feelings to spaces, right? Like a city can take on a particular feeling for you based on what's happened in that city. And sometimes you need to get out of that city and then come back to it. And like you can see it with fresh eyes. And this, I always find that like whenever I'm in a new place, I'm all the more ready to have new ideas or new experiences or like re-examine things simply because the spatial information coming at me is novel. It's new.
Oh yeah.
And that recontextualize. Go for it.
Oh well, I love talking about memory, and especially as it pertains to like this kind of entertainment, like immersive entertainment industry that we're in, because memory and sense are so intrinsically linked. And when it comes to the arts and entertainment, the sensory engagement that's involved in like experience and participation of the audience, it's like it's that multi-sensory element of immersive art is going to create stronger triggers of memory and overall like a more impactful attraction, since people remember what they experience more the more senses are involved, because senses work in tandem. You don't just have one sensory organ like capturing the memory and experience of just that one thing that one sensory organ does. When you hear something, there's so much more to it. It's the vibrations all around you that affect like every single one of your senses. They're all bleeding into one another. And the more that you have that like going on in a space that your sensory memory can latch onto, the more you can remember it.
I think that's one half of the equation that's interesting for me. That idea, like you can kind of wedge in there, right? Like there's these more hooks for people to latch onto as to have the takeaway of what the experience was. But I also think that it becomes this invitation for people to bring more of themselves, and that there's more people are able to explore more ideas. People are more modes of being, or bring more of themselves to the experience at the same time, because you're making these affordances. You're opening up because, you know, let's say one of the hooks you're playing with is olfactory senses, like smell, and like, okay, we're going to pump the smell of fresh bread like into here because we want people to, like, you know, associate fresh bread, the smell of fresh bread, with this, you know, storyline we're doing about, I don't know, the Bride of Dracula or something. I'm just thinking like Universal for a second. Bride of Dracula's not even a thing, is it? I can't remember. Anyway, call me. So like, you know, why would bread and Dracula? I don't know. Dracula bread and trademark Noah Nelson 2024. But someone's going to come and maybe have a really strong association themselves already with that smell, and so they're going to start reminiscing, or they're going to start bringing, you know, it's Proust. It's Proust and the Madeline, right? You know, like you're going to start doing that reverie thing. So it becomes, if not necessarily in this big narrative sense, right, of like building a story in a in a macro, in a shared sense of it all, on an individual level, it becomes this moment of co-creation, right?
Mhm.
Like the story is telling, you know, the installation is telling a story, and the smell of fresh bread is very important to a character in there, and you walk in and the smell of fresh bread is important to you, and suddenly you have something in common with that character, and your stories are entwined, right?
Right.
Your story and their story get entwined.
It's not the effect on the audience isn't based on just the smell or the meaning of a smell that the artist is putting forward their intention, but it's rather the participant who gives it that kind of like anamnestic value that evokes their past with like through the present situation that they're in. It's like evoking this memory that they're putting forth, so they're giving the immersive art piece like their own flavor of meaning based on like their life experience. But that's the same thing with all kinds of like all art, completely all art.
Oh yeah, but I think the thing, and I think you even point to it, like in like the construction of like that nostalgia purgatory capstone piece, right? Is by opening up these other senses, by opening up these affordances, right? Like you're creating more opportunities for people to do that exact action, right? Or more angles that, like maybe someone doesn't respond to the visual aesthetic, but they respond to the scent. Maybe they don't
Right.
respond to, this, but they respond to that. Uh, you know, uh, yeah.
And it brings it back to archetypes, because that's this like one thing that over across culture and time, like we humans tend to be able to relate to archetypes of storytelling. That's why like back to tarot or like commedia dell'arte or like something that's like really basic like storytelling. You don't have, with commedia dell'arte, I bring that up just because you didn't have to be like literate or educated to understand it. Like you don't have to be educated in what tarot cards mean for someone who understands like storytelling basics and like archetype basics to make you feel like you can relate to that experience and that story. So there's like a certain like archetypal feeling to the smell of bread that like can be a
Mm.
baseline for everybody.
Oh, like there's a kind of media literacy that happens even before, you know, literal, like verbal literacy, right? And like that's some of what when we start to talk about archetypes, and I know that, like, there's all, when you start going down that route, and I was steeped in Jung, when I was like early in college, and Campbell and everything, and that's been, complicated, uh for me as time has gone on. But I am always attracted back into those modalities because there's something about the idea of how our society kind of lays down a base layer, how some things are kind of determined by just the mechanism, what it means to be human, right? Like, and some of the core kind of mammalian relationships that you find yourself in, just the affordances of our bodies. And there's resonance between that. Oh, Siri, what did Siri find? There was something weird. What did Siri find? Nope, can't find it now. I already just missed it. Um, sorry. I hope that here's what I found got on the table. There's people. Why did no suddenly start talking about Siri?
No, wait.
Uh,
Can you just rewind about a sentence or so?
yeah, yeah. So like, um, I'm not going to cut any of this because the Siri bit is funny to me. Because it does this all the time, like when I'm in class too. I was just like, "What are you doing, Siri?" She's such an attentive student.
She's listening.
So,
She's really listening.
um, so like when I was look, I got turned on to Campbell, like Joseph Campbell, right? Power of
Mhm.
Myth, Here a Thousand Faces, because of Star Wars. Shock. And and did a lot of my kind of school research in high school was, Campbellian and Jungian. I happen to be lucky in that my English teacher, Bruce Green, hi Bruce, doesn't listen to the show. Maybe I'll tell him that I shouted out to him. Maybe he will this time. So Bruce was also like really into archetypes of the unconscious, and like interested in Jung and stuff. A lot of his stuff. He was really interested in like Ken Kesey's kind of take on this sort of stuff. Um, Ken Kesey has an electric Kool-Aid acid test. One flew of the cuckoo's nest. Ken Kesey. So we I did a lot of reading and research. I read like all of Campbell's Masks of God series, which is like a follow-up to Hero with a Thousand Faces, which is like very, very much in depth. And like one of the things you find there, right, is like it's all about, that there are these kind of universal human archetypes. And there are other very well braced up schools of thought that's kind of say like, oh, well, that's all bunk, right? Like there is no universal human archetypes. There's people who reject Jung wholeheartedly, and because there's kind of there's a mystic-ish dimension to Jung, and Campbell's based a lot on Jungian.
Mhm.
And there's ways in which the archetypes, or see, I default to Campbell. There's ways in which, if you look at different cultures, there is specificity, and there are other kind of, there are other archetypes in other cultures. There are other modes of story. The hero story is not the be all and end all of everything. Even if Hollywood latched onto that in the mid 80s, and then every single, thing was like, the hero cycle. The hero cycle works, right? It works real well. There are other modalities, but I think that the reason why the Jungian mode, the Campbellian mode of thought still has an allure and has some power and insight is that there are things about just the way, humans as mammals on this planet, right? Like are constructed, that we're going to tend to have certain kinds of experiences
Right.
where,
That's
or we're going to have, or we're going to not have certain kinds of experiences that others of our species are going to have. And that's going to create friction in perception, right? Someone who, doesn't have the same experience of family as someone else, there becomes this gap. But there are these archetypes that get embedded into a culture, and some of them are very, very, very similar because of the basic mammalian functionality. I've lost everybody. I've lost myself. So
right. I mean, no, I agree with you. So I'm not a great like contra point because I also kind of lean back into Jung and again Joseph Campbell. But what I remember most for my takeaway from Hero with a Thousand Faces is just that his examples of stories from many different cultures across time and areas of the world. There are Native American stories that have plenty in common with like the really well-known, European and Greco-Roman, mythologies that also have a lot in common with African mythologies, and Chinese mythologies. And it's just a kind of funny coincidence that we've all got different star stories for like the celestial bodies up there, like major cultures. And there's plenty that is universal in my opinion, like the mystery of night, or an elder, an elder's influence on a young mind, and or like an abusive parental figure, or there's these human experiences that no matter what culture you grew up in is like part of human nature, to think of monsters in the darkness that you can't see, and the comfort of someone who took care of you when you needed to be raised, or when you were young. Like there are universals that are the best archetypes, because then they can really go across culture and across language and be related to no matter who the audience is.
yeah, and for me, it's this stuff becomes part of like a locking, mechanism in culture, or an unlocking mechanism in culture, where it's like, you know, the role, the role of a mother for an individual, the role of a mother in a society, and the different ways those express. You can start to see like, oh, okay, yeah, and then the role of women in a particular society, and that things change over time and change, in different parts of the world. It becomes one tool by which we're able to kind of orient ourselves and examine the stories that we have in front of us, the way we can understand the lives of others, the way we can understand the ways in which we are similar and the ways which are different, the ways in which, most importantly, we kind of co-create the consensus of reality around us, which I don't mean just in like I don't mean like necessarily in like a mystical way, but in kind of a political way, because that's that the things that we cling to, that we understand to be the truths of the way the world works, that then become the ways in which we operate and what we expect out of the sort of the rules of the society.
Right.
Again, the coffee just ran out. I warned everyone that philosophical waxing would happen, and lo and behold, we got there.
Here we are.
Here
Um,
we are.
well, I think that the audience is the main character, and like what role, like you, if you're playing yourself in this like immersive sort of experience that you might be like going through as an audience member or as a designer or whatever, like the role of the audience is so different now that we like are trying to put a name to this like immersive storytelling. It's like it's being recalled that the participant is the listener, around the fireplace. Like we're hearing these stories, and maybe you're being told a spooky fairy tale so that you don't wander into the woods at night if you're a 16th century child in the middle of nowhere or something. But like if you're just listening to the story at bedtime, you're not playing a character in it, except that you have the theater in your mind that's playing it out. But with this like immersive entertainment, whether we're talking about like video games or VR, or like RPG styles, or theme parks where you're like going through a dark ride or going on foot through something, or Sleep No More where you're wearing a mask, like it's doing something novel. You are really a character in there. You're affecting things, or you can at least feel like you are.
Well, I also think, particularly if we think about you know narrative agency being afforded to the audience, I always think about bedtime stories from like a parent to a child, right?
Mhm.
Like, and some parents are the the kind of stories they'll be very reactive to a kid's suggestions, right? Like, well, what happened, what's in the closet, right? And the parent, like, in so many ways, like that's the original one-on-one D&D session, right? Like, just improvising stories for a kid at bedtime, and the kid is directing, is the director, and the parent is the writer, and performer, kind of going in real time. And in so many ways, that little relationship is, for me, I always think of that being like kind of the form of all of this interactive storytelling, right? Is it ultimately, it boils down into, but what's over there, right? But why? Right. But why? And then you either go like, shut up, kid, this is my story. It's like, congratulations, we're in auteur land. Or you're like, okay, well, see, his parents were murdered in an alley, because the Earth story is, of course, Batman's. Um, so I had to find a dismount somewhere. It's usually a joke. Jaden, thank you for a lovely almost hour of
Oh wow,
chatting
ready.
about all the work you've been up to, and about art and philosophy, which, like I said, I knew we'd get to sooner or later. Can you remember what was it cracked? Now we've been at this for like 25 minutes, and I don't remember what cracked us into it, but it was going to happen sooner or later.
The threshold.
You're in
It was the
freelance mode right
threshold.
now, if memory serves. So if folks want to find more about your work and your portfolio, and reach out, where can they find you?
Sure thing. Well, I have a dedicated Instagram for my immersive work, and that involves all that festival work and personal projects and what I'm working on now. That's Nostalgia Purgatory on Instagram, and I have a portfolio website at jadenandrea.com and also nostalgiapurgatory.com. It'll probably take you to the same place. Maybe under construction as we are speaking, but hopefully by the time the episode comes out, it'll be all buckled up. So and then you can email me at jadenandrea@gmail.com too.
All right. Well, Thank you so much. And as always, a joy to get a chance to talk this stuff with you.
It's always a joy. Thank you, Noah.
Once again, I want to thank Jaden for being our guest on the show this week. Check the show notes to check out Jaden's portfolio. And yeah, that's the show this week. You had like an hour of us. So Jacob, are you happy? Are you happy now, Jacob? Now that the football season's over and your Sundays aren't taken up by watching certain teams and getting just so frustrated. Anyway, now he's like, you're trolling me on the end of... No, I'm not. We know both of our teams lost. I don't even watch football. Jacob Patterson of Think Tank Gallery, dear friend, who I haven't talked to in a few weeks because of football. No, probably because of football, because of the playoffs, and he's like, deep in it. I think he's happy right now from what happened. I'm happy from what happened last weekend, even though like I grew up in the Bay Area and I was born during yes, my true birth, revised reality. I came up during the Montana and Rice and Young and Rice dynasty years of the 49ers. Bill Walsh, George Seifert, right? Like I can say names all day. Dwight Clark. Buried deep. Those were not even buried deep. Frighteningly, like really close in my brain, right? But I don't watch football anymore because it makes me sad because seeing how all the hits always turned my hero's brains into pudding. So there's that, but it's hard coded into me. So if you're ever out with me on a Sunday and we're somewhere and there's a football game on, particularly if there's a 49ers game on, please forgive me if I zone out and focus entirely on the television. I literally can't help it. I am drawn to it like T-Rexes to moving objects. The strategy, the playmaking, I love it so, but I also know the cost of it is horrendous. So I just try to stay away from it. Although I also have a habit of watching the scores by refreshing Google. So, look, we all do what we need to do to get through this life. I make this show. You listen to it. What is wrong with us? Okay. Sorry. The coffee, of course, from Yes Please is working. Shout out, Tony. Yeah. You know what? I said I wouldn't talk too much about the Emmys. Almost because I got to write this stuff down. I really wish that all I had to do was speak into this microphone and then everything was, all the problems of my life would go away, but they don't. They just multiply. Maybe the longer I'm on the mic. We've done the Emmys a few times now. Emmys being the No Proscenium Awards, and we've done them differently every time because we're trying to figure out, what's good, what's right, what's equitable. Also, we started them, like a few things got started during the high pandemic, and that meant almost all the work was remote. And now there's very little remote work, and almost all the work is regional. So how the hell do you do regional awards? There's a couple ways we can do them. And indeed, probably over the long haul of things, maybe we'll dust off some of the old Leia playbook. Once upon a time when we were organizing the 501c6 and trying to create a community group, a nonprofit that way, before the pandemic, before the dark times, we were planning chapter houses all over the states, and even in working together with friends like the Immersive Experience Network in London, and doing things that way, and creating a community controlled entity that was fighting for everybody, and would probably wind up doing some award stuff because that's the low hanging fruit, and as silly as it is, as frustrating as it is, as internal politicking as it gets, nothing motivates people quite like an awards. It's just the nature of humans. But then, for all sorts of reasons, Leia got mothballed, and might get resurrected as a sub project one day. There's just things about like the financial structure. Anyway, God, and now I'm blathering. I'm like, oh, look into Noah's fractured brain. The Emmys. We've done them a few times. We've done them where just the NoPro editors, the review crew controls what's going on. We've done it where there was lots of voting on categories from anyone and everyone, pure popularity contest. This year, we think we have a format that is one step closer to what the final form will be. I already have ideas of what the next format's going to be because of what we're doing this time, but I don't want to try to implement it. Also, it's going to take 6 months worth of work to make that proper. That format is... No, I'm kidding. I will talk about the format next week because I want to write these things down. But nevertheless, the heart of it is there will be one award that is open to anyone who wants to vote on it. A big reader award. But the vast majority of the regional and category-based awards are going to be, the voting will be done by the backers of No Proscenium. That's going to be who gets to vote. So, if you want to get in on that action, more details on that coming in the next week. Voting's going to be open for a couple of weeks. It'll be a relatively fast turnaround. And more soon. This is a very long episode now. I'll talk to you next week. Let's do the ending bit. The associate producer of this podcast is Parker Sella. Music for No Proscenium is by Chris Porter of the Speakeasy Society and Solar the Podcast. Special thanks to Siobhan O'Loughlin for voicing our intro. This podcast is made by yours truly. Until next time. Wait, that's not how that goes. I'm Noah Nelson. And until next time, I'll see you at the show.